Hi everyone, welcome to the January 15th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragone, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to do some handicapping of weekend races, focusing primarily on the Fairgrounds card. They've got a slew of stakes races taking place on Saturday, topped by that first in their series of Derby preps, the Grade 3 Lecomte. That's the final race, 13, on their Saturday card. But we're going to talk about the All-Stakes Pick 4 starting in race 10, also the Duncan F, which is race 3 on that card. That's a turf sprint taking place early in the day. But the pick 4 sequence is good. You've got a pretty competitive edition of the Louisiana, the Colonel Bradley, the Silver Bullet Day for the 3-year-old fillies, that filly counterpart to the Lecomte, and then that Derby prep closing things out. And then before we close things out on the podcast, we're going to head over to Gulfstream Park and talk about one race from their Florida bred card, the Sunshine Sprint, where there's a horse that I'm a little bit interested in betting to beat that favorite Extravagant Kid. But we're going to start things out at the Fairgrounds, and Craig, it's a pretty good card. As we were talking about just before we hit record, there are a few cross entries in some races, some horses that are likely to scratch, but I think the main players in all these races are staying in.
Yeah, it seems like there were so many cross-enter, we had to do a little pregame, which is something we never really do any other time. But at least we got it all straightened out, in large part thanks to our co-worker Marcus Hirsch, who was on top of things at the Fairgrounds and kept everybody updated on Twitter as to who's actually going to run where and what day. So good for him. I always follow Marcus. He's a good one, particularly with the Fairgrounds in that region. So yeah, this, as I mentioned last week, this is kind of the week I look to as almost the start of the Triple Crown season. I know there's been point races even this year, but the Lecomte always just seems to be the one that really kicks things off and gets things started for me.
Yeah, I feel the same way about it. We've got some races that take place around that New Year's weekend, but it does always feel like the Lecomte is the start of the Derby prep season. We'll get to that race in a little bit, though. Let's start things out with that first stakes race that's taking place on Fairgrounds on Saturday. That's race 3, the Duncan F Kenner, going 5.5 furlongs on the turf. And I didn't see any horses that are expected to come out of here. We do have a couple that are entered back on pretty short rest, but this is a pretty competitive group. I would say that the horse to beat is probably the one on the outside, Archidust, who is coming off a victory at the Fairgrounds, winning that stakes race back in mid-December, beating a couple of today's rivals. He got a great trip that day, but he's the kind of horse that has the running style where he's often going to work out a good trip. He seems like the horse to beat if he runs back to that last race.
Yeah, he does seem the horse to beat, but I'm not going to concede the race to him. I think it's a strong, deep field, and I almost think you can make a case for every single runner in the field, at least a fringe case. We do have a couple trying turf for the first time in their careers. The 6 Went West and the 7 Manny Wah. And for those, I think it would be a bit of a stretch. Not that they can handle turf, but this is a pretty deep waters to jump into first time out, and I think it would be a real stretch for either of these two to win. You mentioned horse coming back on short rest. Marcus did mention that Born Great, he's coming back on like 10 days rest, I think. He is expected to go. He draws inside. He's a horse who won an allowance race impressively, and I think we just talked about him on last week's Pacecast, if memory serves. So good deep field. The pace projector has a couple horses shown up front, ready for prime time and Just Might, but no label where it's a fast pace or favoring horses on or near the lead. So looks like a good solid pace. The horse I'm going to try to beat Archidust with is that aforementioned ready for prime time. I really liked how he ran for Brad Cox in his debut. He was previously trained by Linda Rice. He moved down to the Fairgrounds, moved into that Cox barn, and just looked like a new horse. I mean, not that he was a bad horse before, but it was by far his most impressive race to date. And if anything, he was really flattered by Born Great's return, where he won, because he handled him pretty easily that day. So anything near that 5-1 morning line, I'm going to be on ready for prime time.
Yeah, ready for primetime definitely scares me. I mean, anything coming from the Brad Cox barn certainly has to. And as you said, he was visually impressive last time. Born Great, he had his chance. He was coming at the horse late, but ready for primetime just kind of kicked on and held him off. Ready for primetime, while he was setting an honest pace in that race, he did get loose up front, and he is the kind of horse that does seem to run his best races when he gets that clear lead. That was also the case when he won at Saratoga over the summer, when previously in Linda Rice's barn. So I'm a little bit concerned about the presence of Just Might, because you think that horse would really have to press him, and even Real Money to his inside has a little bit of speed as well. So we'll see if there's a more competitive pace scenario for Ready for Prime Time, but I think he's definitely a horse that you have to use in here, just given the form that he's in. And if you're trying to beat Archidust, as you were saying, there are so many options. You can make a case for a lot of these horses. I mean, Fast Boat is a horse that could certainly run well enough to win a race like this on his best day. You just don't always know what you're going to get from him, because he can be a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde runner. I'm going to take a shot against the favorite with the number 7 Maniwa, who is making his turf debut in here. He's a horse that does have enough turf pedigree, not to necessarily say that he's supposed to move up on this surface, but I think he's got enough to handle it. He's by Will Take Charge, who was not a turf horse during his racing career, but Will Take Charge has proven to be a decent turf sire. And on the dam side, his dam was a strictly turf synthetic runner, actually won a minor stakes race on the turf. And the dam is a full sister to Blended Citizen, who is another one of these horses that could run on both dirt and turf almost equally well. So I just think Maniwa is interested in getting on the turf here, because I do see some pace in this race, and Maniwa is a closer. He's been in reasonably good form on the dirt lately, arguably the best form that he's been in his entire career, when we just last saw him at the end of his 4-year-old season. So I just think he's an interesting new face in this group that could go off at a bit of a price. I don't think we're going to get much higher than the 5-1, but I envision this as a race where the 2nd through 5th choices are all grouped pretty closely behind Archidust.
Yeah, and you probably are giving him a little extra credit because he allowed Bone Raison to beat him by a nose a few starts back, which I remember pretty well. Bone Raison was a pretty big price that day, if I remember. Just teasing on that. I do have the same concerns you do with Ready for Prime Time and Just Might, but just at that short distance, I'm not sure these two are going to duel each other into defeat. I wouldn't bet Ready for Prime Time if he gets bet down to 5-2 or anything like that, but just looking for more of a price than we're going to get from Archidust, a horse who, while I mean, I guess he should be the favorite, I don't think he has any great advantage over most of this field.
We're just lucky they didn't enter Bone Raison in this race, because, I can't resist that horse under any circumstances. Let's move on to that late pick 4 sequence at the fairgrounds, races 10 through 13, beginning with that 10th race, the Grade 3 Louisiana Stakes, going a mile and a 16th on the dirt for the older horses. And I found this to be a very interesting race. It's really hard to know where the public's going to go. I see the slight morning line favorite is the number 8 Wells Bayou. I don't really know what to do with that horse. He was pretty disappointing when we last saw him in the Arkansas Derby, facing a tough field, but I was never the biggest fan of this horse going all the way back to early in his 3-year-old season. I know he won that Louisiana Derby. I'm not sure how strong that race really was. It didn't feel that strong at the time. I know New York Traffic's come back to run, to place in some lucrative stakes afterwards, but I just wasn't thrilled with that field at the time, and I think generally we haven't seen horses distinguish themselves out of that race. And Wells Bayou, he does have some other pace to contend with in here, so I don't know. This was a Brad Cox horse that I was going to try to beat.
Yeah, I'm with you in that. I think what's interesting for me about this race is we have some horses we've seen repeatedly over the years. I should note it does look like Captivating Moon is going to run in this spot and not the Bradley later on the card. He's cross-entered in both, as he always is on these Louisiana Stakes race days. But I'm with you. Blackberry Wine and Wells Bayou are both speed horses. They're both 4-year-olds they just have done nothing but show high speed. So it's hard to imagine those two not hooking up at least at some point in the race and setting things up for somebody else. I'm not a fan of any of the older horses in here. And by older, I mean not the newly turned 4-year-olds. So the horse I settled on, I went to the outside and went with Sonneman. He's a horse who's just been running solid races for a long time. He's getting better and better. And I think his form's really disguised a little bit by his last two. Two back, he won easily at Churchill with a 1:19 TimeformUS speed figure, but he did so tracking a really slow pace, which kind of held him back. His final time figure was 1:21 that day. Next time out, when he was second to Maxfield in his return at the fairgrounds, once again the pace was really slow. He was further off of it, and he was able to get up to second, run a solid second that day, as he should have. It wasn't the strongest field outside of Maxfield, but I just think he's got more in the tank than those 117 and 119 that I've seen the last two times. He should get plenty of pace in here, so I don't think the outside post is going to be too big of an issue, and I look for a big race from him.
I'm glad we have a difference of opinion here because my two top picks are horses that are not newly turned 4-year-olds. I can't fault you for thinking if those horses have some upside, and I do generally agree with your take on Sonoman. I think he's a horse that was rounding into form at the end of last year, and I did like that allowance win 2 back. He was never really a threat to Maxfield in that tenacious last time, but he was staying on well enough at the end of that race, enough to back up that impressive allowance score 2 back. So I'm not way against him. I'm also not against the other newly turned 4-year-old for Steve Asmussen, Silver Prospector. He could be a slightly better price, and I mean, he was breaking from post 14 in the Clark last time. He was wide, about 4 to 5 wide around both turns in that race, so he really didn't get a chance to show what he could do in that spot. His prior races, they're not as fast or as impressive visually maybe as Sonoman ran in that allowance race, but he's got some good form, even going back to last year when he won that Southwest with a fast speed figure. So I think Silver Prospector is somewhat interesting at here. But the horses that I picked in the first 2 positions that I'm most interested in playing here, they're both a little older. My top pick is going to be the number 6 Title Ready. He's a horse that he doesn't find the winner's circle that often, and he hasn't been too competitive in his last few starts, but he is coming out of a couple of Grade 1 stakes races, the Breeders' Cup Classic and the Clark. His Breeders' Cup actually wasn't terrible. I mean, he passed some tired rivals late. He was never going to be a threat to horses like Authentic and Improbable, but he stayed on and ran a reasonable speed figure that day. And last time out in the Clark, he finished behind Silver Prospector with a ground-saving trip, whereas that one was wide. But if you watch that race, that was a pretty traffic-filled, congested field, and Corey Lannery just kept this horse at the back of the pack, really made no effort to motivate him on the far turn, was kind of just waiting inside as if the race was going to fall apart and the rail was going to open up, and that just never happened. And I mean, he did try to come through late on the inside, but was asked to do running when the race was already over. So I just questioned the ride and the tactics that day. But he ran fine in that Fayette 3 back, and overall, I mean, he's achieved a level of consistency here that I think puts him in the mix in this race. And personally, I see some pace in here, even coming from the rail horse Grand Luigi, and with Blackberry Wine and Wells Bayou signed on, I think they're going to be going an honest clip up front. So I think it could come back enough for Title Ready to get involved. So if he is going to be somewhere near that 6-1 morning line, I think he's very interesting. And the other horse that I would want to use at an even bigger price is the number 5, Indimage. This is a horse who's going to get a real class test here because he's been beating much weaker horses at Tampa Bay Downs, but his last 2 races have been extremely impressive, especially last time when he won that non-winners of 2 other that at 6-5. I mean, he looked like he could have won that race by much more than the 4 3/4 length margin. Jesus Castellon just never asked him for run. I mean, he did it well with it himself. And this is a horse that has a big pedigree. He's out of that Grade 1 winning dam, Lear's Princess. He was a Shadwell horse that I guess they privately sold. Now he's with a new barn. It took him a long time to come around, but it seems like maybe he's the kind of well-bred horse that just has taken until the end of his 5-year-old season, now his 6-year-old, to really hit his stride. But based on his last couple of races, he could be a player in here, and he's definitely going to be a big price.
Yeah, he's the horse I was going to make my second choice. I definitely prefer him of the older horses in here. So for me, like I said, I will almost assuredly be betting this race. I like Sonoman, but who knows what the prices are going to be because it just looks so wide open. But Indimage is one. If he's anywhere near that 12-1, I definitely think he offers some value because, as you said, even though he is an older horse, newly turned 6-year-old, he's actually one that definitely has been improving the last few times out. And that's kind of what I'm looking for in a spot like this.
Moving on to the second leg of this all-stakes late pick 4 sequence, the Colonel E.R. Bradley going the same 1.16 distance, but this time on the turf course. And this is another pretty wide open race. It's really hard to know where the public's going to go. I think a key race that we have to talk about is a race that many of these are coming out of, the Diliberto Memorial from December 19th. That race was won by Logical Myth, who really benefited from his rail draw that day as he was able to sit behind a couple of dueling leaders in the pocket, get out at the top of the stretch and make his run. You could question whether or not he's going to work out another perfect trip, but he does draw the rail again with those same two speed horses signed on, so maybe he's going to get lucky again, but I never like to take horses coming off the kinds of trips that he got.
Yeah, we have very similar notes on him in this race. It's going to be, it looks like a field of 10 as Captivating Moon is coming out, as we mentioned. There's no notation on the pace projector. And, as you noted, Spectacular Gem and Sailing Solo hooked up last time in a pretty fast speed duel, red fractions everywhere. And for me, it's always kind of hard to picture that that's going to happen again. Both get the same two riders back. It's hard to imagine they would make the same mistake twice. I suspect Sailing Solo will go, and maybe Spectacular Gem will sit just off of them, but I think the pace will be toned down a little bit. If not, I can't fault anybody that would like Logical Myth. As you said, he draws the rail, but he's going to be half the price he was last time, so I'm not sure I'd be too interested in that. But I mean, that said, if I had to make a top pick, I'm still going to look outside of those three horses, and I'm actually going to go with my old buddy outside, Mr. Misunderstood. He was a horse I kind of given up on recently. He hasn't looked to be the same horse, but I actually liked his race at Churchill when he was in behind Frostmore. It was a race we covered on last week's forecast, where it was just a merry-go-round and he essentially had no chance that day. Same thing happened his last time out when he tried the synthetic at Turfway. There was absolutely no pace in the race against a horse Set Piece, who is just a monster on that Turfway Park synthetic course. If they had a Breeders' Cup Classic for synthetics, he may very well be one of the favorites in there. And I just think Mr. Understood has some hidden form in here. I think he's better than what he's shown lately, and at a horse who is going to be a much bigger price than he usually is, he's one I want to take a shot with.
That's a fair point up, Mr. Misunderstood. He's not a horse that I'm a big fan of. I know he's run some big speed figures in the past and has shown this kind of form. I thought he's been off form a little bit. You do make some valid excuses for a couple of his recent races, especially that race at Churchill 2 back. I just wonder if he can get back to his better races, and he is going out for Brad Cox. He'll be a price in here. Maybe not the kind of price he'd be for a different trainer, but he definitely does have the back class to rebound if he can get back to his prior races. I agree with you that I'm a little skeptical we're going to see that same speed duel that we got last time at a Spectacular Gem and Sailing Solo. And if I had to take a horse between those two speeds, it would be Sailing Solo, who I thought ran very well last time. He almost survived that pace, lost the entire thing by a half length, even though he was fourth. He battled on pretty gamely in very deep stretch of that race. And whether he's stalking outside or goes on to take the lead, with the latter of which I think is more likely because he's more of a need the lead type than Spectacular Gem. I'm expecting a more moderate pace here, and I think he's going to be tough to run down. And I could have picked him on top. The other horse that I want to use, though, I don't know, I'd call my top pick, but I just think he's the interesting value play for me in this race, is the number 5 Maraud. He's coming off a long layoff, and that's obviously a big question, though Brett Calhoun does have decent numbers coming off layoffs of this type. He just strikes me as a horse that was getting into really good form when we last saw him back in the winter of 2020. He finished a close third and an optional claimer behind the very classy Bala Rocks. But the race that really interests me is his last race, which took place 10 months ago. That was the Appleton back in March of 2020, when he got involved in a very fast pace, actually ran off on the backstretch when challenged by the early move from El Tormenta, who drew a wide post that day and made a premature backstretch move. And Maraud went with that horse, put him away, and got swallowed up by some closers late. But I thought he ran extremely well within the context of that race. It's obviously not great that he hasn't been seen in so long, but they picked a relatively ambitious spot for his return. And as I said, Brett Calhoun can do well off layoffs, so maybe he can get the right stalking trip in this race and be effective, because I do think he's going to be a pretty big price in here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You're definitely taking a shot with him that Calhoun will have him ready. It is first time in his barn as well as he moves out of the barn of Joe Orsino. So, yeah, I got no problem with that pick. He will definitely be a price and showed some form. So it would be hard for me to really fault anybody in here. I really do think this is a pretty wide open race, and a lot of it's just going to come down to the race dynamics and what the two riders that are projected to be up front decide to do.
Moving on to the 12th race at the fairgrounds, the penultimate leg of that pick four sequence. It's the Silver Bullet Day for the 3-year-old fillies, going 1.70 miles on the dirt. And as you were mentioning at the top of the show, there are a few scratches in some of these races that might have an impact. I think this is one that would be impacted by scratches because you had some horses from the middle of the field scratch out, including a potential pace player in the 6 Divine Comedy, who, as you said, Marcus Hirsch tweeted, is not expected to run here. So we've got 2 major players in here, the 1 Super Sensational and the 9 Sunpath, both going out for strong barns, Mark Casse and Brad Cox. I'd imagine the 9 Sunpath is going to be the favorite based on just how impressive her allowance victory was last time out.
Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to get past those 2. As you mentioned, the 4, 5, and 6 are all likely to scratch in here. If I'm playing horizontals, which I probably will, I'm not going to go more than 2 deep because I fully expect one of these 2 to win. If I had to make a top pick, I would probably go with the inside horse for Mark Casse, Super Sensational. She's run twice, both times on the synthetic at Woodbine, but given her breeding by Curlin out of an Indian Charlie mare, I don't really see too many problems moving the dirt. Normally, I would say the inside post would help, but in a small field of 6, I don't think Sunpath outside is really going to get hurt too much. But the thing that interested me the most, the reason I would pick one over the other, I should say, is the race just didn't come back all that fast for Sunpath. For a race where she won by nearly 13 lengths, she only got a 99 TimeformUS speed figure, and that's slower than what Super Sensational was running back in October as a 2-year-old on synthetic. So I'm going to give her the slight lean. I don't love her in here. Like I would totally single her or anything like that. Neither one would surprise me, but anyone else winning would surprise me.
Yeah, from a wagering perspective, I think this is definitely the least interesting race we're going to talk about from the fairgrounds. Like you, I would just try to get through a pick 4 going too deep. I don't really have a strong preference between Super Sensational and Sunpath. Like you, I think Super Sensational certainly could handle the dirt. She's got the pedigree to suggest that she should be able to. I'd even add to what you said that, I mean, her dam is a half-sister to Tismiz Sue, who was a very good dirt router, I think even competing in some Grade 1 stakes races, routing on the dirt back in like the early 2010s. So Super Sensational makes plenty of sense. And Sunpath, I hear you about her races being a little bit slow. She does feel like a horse that's still figuring things out, kind of along the lines of her full sibling Bonnie South, who ran in these races last winter, and she was one that took a little while to come around. And watching Sunpath's last race, I got that same sense from her. She was swapping leads a few times through the lane, even though she was drawing off all by herself. She was a little bit unfocused doing it, so it definitely seems like there's room for improvement with her, but there's room for improvement with both of these fillies, and I think one of them's going to win. And I'm just going to try to get through this sequence using both.
Yeah, and it should be noted, Sunpath did break through the gate last time before the start, which is something we don't often see horses do and then run well. But, I mean, particularly winning by over 12 lengths like she did. So that part at least does give her even more upside than watching the race visually, knowing that she broke through early.
Let's wrap up the fairgrounds action with the final leg of this pick 4 sequence. That is the Derby Prep, the Grade 3 Lecomte, going 1.16 miles on the dirt course. And as you were saying at the top of the show, a few scratches expected here. The number 3 Beep Beep and the number 9 Manor House. I mean, you could see they were cross-entered in an allowance race on this same fairgrounds card, and they're likely to run there. The 11 Dynamite's also expected to scratch. So that would bring the field down to 8 runners. I would imagine we're still going to have the same likely favorite in this race, though, and that's the number 10 Mandaloon, who is undefeated in 2 starts for none other than Brad Cox and Juddmonte Farms, the same connections that have that favorite in the prior race. He's looked pretty good to me, but I wouldn't say that I've been blown away by this horse. I think if you like this horse, you're still kind of going with this idea that he has untapped potential.
Yeah, these are the tough. You got to keep these things in mind with these newly turned 3-year-olds. It's tough to just go by the figures, but this one didn't run particularly fast. We don't have a figure yet. That's actually something I'm working on. That, as you know, you wrote me about, and we will have one soon. But I didn't want to rush to get one in here for his debut. But he only ran a 93. Now it can be argued two horses have come out of that race to win. One improved his figure by 15 points. The runner-up from that race improved his figure by 10 points when running third next time out, a horse named Twilight Blue. So maybe the figure's not all that important, but I still, as a horse who's going to be the favorite, I'd like to see a little faster race from him. So if I was playing this horse, he was 6 or 8 to 1, and I was looking for improvement. Sure, I'd take it in a second. But when you have to improve and be a short price, that's not something I'm too keen on. So I'm going to lean inside to Midnight Bourbon, the Steve Asmussen trained horse who we last saw in the Champagne. He basically got his doors blown off by Jackie's Warrior, but that happened to a lot of horses last year. So I'm not going to knock it too much. Before that, he ran a good second in the Iroquois with a 107 TimeformUS speed figure. So he would be my top pick. On top of that, he's drawn inside and most of the other speed scratched out. So it looks like a race where he should be all by himself up front, or at least not going too fast if pressed a little bit. It's a race where the pace projector currently shows that we expect a fast pace, but that's definitely going to go away. And it's even borderline favors horses on or near the early lead. I don't think it'll quite meet that threshold, but it was really close in here. So I just think he has a tactical edge, a post position edge, and a speed figure edge. So at the longer price, I'll make him my top pick. There is one other horse that interests me in here, and that's the 8-horse Red and Wild. He comes out of the local, for me, Springboard Mile Stakes at Remington Park. He ran a distant third that day, beaten 9 lengths, but he got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. He was beaten by a horse who looks like a pretty freakish one in Senor Buscador that day. So the third place margin's probably a little exaggerated. He was beaten 9.5, but almost 6 of that was by the winner. And I thought he ran really solid, so he's one at a price that I'm definitely going to be using underneath in some vertical bets.
Yeah, we're on the same page for our top pick here. The number 1 Midnight Bourbon makes a lot of sense for all the reasons that you stated. His maiden win was pretty impressive at Ellis Park. Like you, I'm not holding that large margin loss in the Champagne against him given the competition. And it just seems like Steve Asmussen's found a pretty good spot for his 3-year-old debut. A couple of other points that I'd make about him is, he might be helped the most by the scratch of that speed horse, although those few speed horses, because 3 of the horses on the Timeform's pace projector that were in the top 4 slots are all out of the race now. So that's going to help Midnight Bourbon. And another thing is, I was looking through DRF Formulator and looking at some of Steve Asmussen's stats, and Steve Asmussen's a tough trainer to look up stats for because he competes at so many different circuits, and the stats can really vary from circuit to circuit and assistant to assistant. But I looked up specifically horses coming off 70 to 130-day layoffs, which is kind of plus or 30, the 100-day layoff that Midnight Bourbon's coming off of, in dirt route graded stakes races. So those are horses that are kind of the high-profile Asmussen runners. He's 10 for 26 over the past 5 years, winning at 38% with a $3.34 ROI. You do have horses like Midnight Bisou and Gunrunner in that sample, but you've got others as well. So he does well off these kinds of layoffs with his top-level horses. And I just think Midnight Bourbon, if he takes that any kind of step forward from his 2-year-old form, he's going to be tough in here. One other horse that I do want to mention before we move on, you threw in the Remington Park horse. A horse that I'm interested in, not necessarily for this race, but just as a horse, is the number 4 Proxy for Mike Stidham and Godolphin. He has looked a little unfocused in his last couple starts. He's slowly but surely coming around. He's very green. I think this is probably a big ask for him, even though he's won 2 in a row. This is a big step up in class, but more so, I'm looking for him on the turf in the future. They tried to get him on turf first time out. He was rained off. He's done well in the dirt since then, but he's a half-brother to that good turf horse Micheline, and just the way this horse moves, I think he's going to like the turf eventually when he gets there. So just one to keep in the back of your mind or put in your stable mail, maybe to follow for a turf start in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point about him. I also like the shape of his figures, as he has that look of a turf horse, because even though he's won wire to wire on dirt the last two times, he's done it while gradually increasing his figure throughout the race all the way to the finish. And that's generally a good sign in what you want to see for horses moving to the grass.
Let's close out this podcast by discussing one more race, and this is one that I threw into the mix because there's a horse in here that I'm interested in. It's the 10th race at Gulfstream on Saturday. It's the Sunshine Sprint. This is that the vestiges of that Sunshine Millions program that they used to run back in the I don't know, this is probably over a decade ago when they used to run those races out in California and Florida for the California and Florida breds. But this is the Sunshine Sprint going 6 furlongs. And the favorite in here is going to be the number 5 Extravagant Kid, who is a horse that can run on both surfaces. Craig, though, this is a horse that I wouldn't really want to take at a short price because I feel like over time, these older horses, they start to gravitate more towards one surface, and it's tough to keep transitioning back and forth from dirt to turf.
Yeah, he's a horse I definitely want to take a shot against. As you mentioned, he's a horse who's run well on both, but I think it's pretty clear, especially at this point in his career, that he's better on turf. I can't blame the connections for taking a shot in what seems to be a pretty easy field, but I don't like him at all in here. I don't like where he's shown on the pace projector for a 6 furlong dirt race. He is pretty far back in the field, So I looked elsewhere. I'm going to throw it back to you because I have a feeling we landed on the same horse, and you're the one who wanted to talk about this race, so I'll give you the first crack on this one.
Yeah, and just to finish up Extravagant Kid, I should note he's the defending champion in this race. He won this race last year when he beat the mare Ladies Island and dueled her into defeat, but coming into that race, he had shown a lot more tactical speed, and it seems like he's lost that speed in his recent starts on the turf, so I'm concerned about that pace projector because it's in line with his recent races. He just doesn't seem to have that same speed that he once possessed, at least in the early stages of a race, and that's concerning in a race that does feature a lot of front-running speed, and one of those horses is my top pick, the number 9, Inter Miami, but at least he's drawn outside of all the other speeds, so I'm not as concerned about the trip for him, and he just strikes me as a horse that's really turned a corner recently. He showed some promise early in his 3-year-old season, but it's taken him a little while to come around for I would say for the new barn. He was with Juan Carlos Guerrero. Now he's off a trainer switch for Georgina Baxter. I don't know if it's a real trainer switch because he's been training at Parks, and I don't think he's been with the new barn for that long, but they're shipping him down for this race because he is a Florida bred, so he's eligible to run here. But I thought he ran really well too back at Parks, surviving a fast pace to be second, but I really like his last race at Aqueduct. That was a race that was won by Mitres Porciento, who, when he's good, he's a very good allowance horse. He can post some big speed figures. And December 19th, the day he ran, that was a day that featured a strong rail bias on the dirt at Aqueduct. You really had to be inside to be effective on that card. And Inter Miami was chasing about 4 wide the entire way, losing ground around the far turn. And considering that trip, he was one of the few horses on that entire card that was that wide, and he continued to run on at the end of the race. So I just think he ran much better than it even seems that day. And if he can improve on that 112 Timeformula speed figure that he got, I think he's going to be a big player in here.
Yeah, and that's why I throw it back to you. We landed on the same horse for a lot of the same reasons, and I would even say based on the speed figures, he might not even have to improve. I suspect he will a little bit based on that trip, but that 112 is the best dirt figs that we've seen in the field recently, so we're on the same horse. I do want to mention number 1, Old Time Revival is shown up front. He's a huge price on the morning line. He's the second TimeformUS power pick, but I just want to throw some caution out there. And this is part of why I like Inter Miami as well, in that a lot of his stuff is based on that really big figure he ran when he set a super fast pace in the DeFrancis Dash back over a year ago in 2019. He got a 120 that day. But that was back when GPS timing was new and we didn't really know the problems with it. And I wasn't timing all the races from video. So there's a time frame where I'm not super confident in those Laurel figures. And this would be one of them. It's one I even mentioned beforehand. I don't know if you'll recall, where I said I just didn't trust them. I couldn't explain why these horses would suddenly run faster figures, but it was just something, you didn't want to guess when making speed figures. And at the time, I had no reason not to trust the times that were being given to us. That's obviously since changed, and races like this are a large part of why GPS started coming under question. I do think it's getting better, and we are timing all the races from video now, to be sure, but back then we weren't, and there's going to be some figures that probably aren't too good back from that time.
That's a good note about Old Time Revival, because you might be a little curious just looking at his last race why he would be positioned so close to the pace, and a lot of that is based on form from a year ago or more, and based on the last race he might not even be quick enough to get away from the rail and get to the lead here, so we'll see what we get from him second off the layoff. But good note about that race at Laurel from late in 2019. That's all the racing we've got to handicap this week. Of course, we'll recap all these races when we do the TimeformUS Pacecast next week, talk about that Derby prep and any implications it might have going forward on the Derby trail. And just looking forward to talking about more of these preps as they come. This is always an exciting time of the year to talk about the 3-year-olds and everybody else who is just turned a new age and might be stepping up in class. Everybody, thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for that TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.